There is an island in the Great Lakes where, every single morning at exactly the same hour, a cannon still fires from the walls of a 19th century fort, the way it is fired every morning for longer than most Americans' great-grandparents have been alive. Horses pull carriages down streets that have never once felt the weight of a car tire. The air smells like lilacs in June and melting sugar in a fudge shop window in July. More than 1 million people will walk those streets this year, more than have ever walked them before, and almost every single one of those visitors will leave believing they have just seen a place frozen perfectly in time. What almost none of them will see, because it happens after the last ferry pulls away each evening, is a school with fewer than 60 students left in it, a housing market where a modest 3-bedroom home sells for more than $1 million, and a year-round population that has shrunk to a number smaller than a single graduating class at most American high schools. The island is not disappearing. The people who actually live there, permanently, all winter, every winter, are. If you're new here, this channel covers the American cities that rose, fell, and are still living with the consequences today. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. This is Mackinac Island, Michigan, and it is on paper one of the most successful tourist destinations in the entire country. Roughly 1 million to 1.2 million people visit every year, drawn to a place USA Today has repeatedly named the best summer travel destination in America. The island's population, however, tells a completely different story. Fewer than 600 people live there year-round. Some counts put the true winter number closer to 500. That is not a decline from some much larger historical peak, the way a fading Rust Belt city might describe its collapse. It is something stranger, a place whose fame and visitor numbers have only grown, while the number of people willing or able to actually live there has stayed almost impossibly small, generation after generation, for well over a century. The island's transformation into a resort began in the final decades of the 1800s, after its earlier life as a fur trading post and military outpost had faded with the closing of the frontier. Wealthy vacationers from Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, and Buffalo began arriving by lake steamer, seeking the cool air and sweeping views the island offered. And in 1887, railroad and boat companies financed the construction of a hotel unlike anything else in the region. The Grand Hotel, a sprawling Victorian resort with what would become the longest porch of any hotel in the world, stretching 660 feet along the bluff overlooking the Straits of Mackinac. The hotel was an immediate sensation, and it set the template the island has followed ever since. Build an experience so exclusive, so carefully preserved, and so removed from ordinary American life that people would pay enormous sums simply to visit it for a few days. 11 years after the Grand Hotel opened, the island made the decision that would define its entire identity going forward. On July 6, 1898, a group of local carriage drivers, worried that the sputtering new horseless carriages beginning to appear on the mainland would spook their horses and ruin the island's business, petitioned the village council to ban automobiles outright. The council agreed. 3 years later, the State Park Commission that controlled most of the island's land followed suit. What began as a practical measure to protect a local carriage industry from a competing technology became, over the following century, the single most important marketing decision in the island's history. As the rest of America filled with highways, parking lots, and traffic, Mackinac Island remained the only place in the country where a person could not legally drive a car at all, a status it holds to this day on what is still the only state highway in America closed to motor vehicles. That decision to freeze the island in time turned out to be extraordinarily good for business. It is today almost certainly bad for anyone who actually wants to build a life there. Because everything on Mackinac Island has to arrive by boat or small plane, and because nearly every available acre of buildable land was already claimed by hotels, historic cottages, and the enormous state park that covers roughly 80% of the island, the cost of simply existing on Mackinac Island has climbed to a level that has nothing to do with the wages available there. A modest island home with 3 bedrooms recently sold for $600,000. Larger historic properties sell well into the 7 figures. Meanwhile, the seasonal jobs that keep the island running, the ones scrubbing hotel rooms, flipping fudge on marble slabs, and rowing tourist luggage from the ferry docks in luggage carts because trucks are not allowed, pay somewhere between $12 and $25 an hour. That gap between what it costs to live on Mackinac Island and what the island's own economy pays its workers is the real engine behind everything that has happened to the year-round population over the past several decades. It has become, functionally, almost impossible for an ordinary American worker to build a life there. A University of Michigan student working a summer register job at $15 an hour described saving almost nothing by the time the season ends, even with employer-provided housing, because every other cost on the island is priced for tourists, not employees. The math simply does not work, and the island's businesses solve that problem the same way ski resorts, national park gateway towns, and other geographically isolated tourist economies across the country have solved it. They stopped trying to staff themselves primarily with Americans at all. Mackinac Island now relies on roughly 5,000 temporary seasonal workers every single year to keep its hotels, restaurants, and fudge shops running through the summer rush, a workforce nearly 10 times the size of the island's entire year-round population. A large share of those workers arrive through the J-1 Exchange Visitor Visa program, recruited from countries where even the island's modest hourly wages represent a genuinely life-changing amount of money, sometimes enough to fund an entire year of expenses back home from a single Michigan summer. For the island's hotels and shop owners, the arrangement is close to ideal. No payroll taxes on exchange visitors, no long-term commitment, a guaranteed seasonal exit every fall, and a labor force with far less bargaining power than local hires might have. For the workers themselves, reporting has described overcrowded employer-provided housing, hidden fees deducted from paychecks for rent, uniforms, and transportation, and in some documented cases, effective pay that falls below minimum wage once those deductions are taken into account. The consequence of building an economy this way is written directly into the island's own institutions. The Mackinac Island Public School, which once served a genuine year-round community of families the way small-town schools across America still do, now enrolls somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 to 60 students across all grades combined, kindergarten through 12th. That is not the enrollment of a struggling rural school district facing gradual decline. That is the enrollment of an institution serving what remains of a community that has been almost entirely priced out of its own island by the very tourism industry that made the island famous in the first place. The island's leaders are not blind to this. In 2020, the city of Mackinac Island partnered with a nonprofit developer to build a small set of workforce townhomes, renting 2- and 3-bedroom units for $850 to $1,050 a month, a price roughly a quarter of what comparable space would cost on the open island market, specifically because the private housing market had become unworkable for the teachers, police officers, and year-round tradespeople. The island still needs to actually function in January, when the ferries slow down, the hotels close, and the population that remains has to get through a Great Lakes winter essentially on its own. This is the mechanism that ties Mackinac Island to a pattern playing out across resort economies throughout the country, from ski towns in Colorado to beach communities in California, where the same headline keeps repeating in local news. A place becomes so successful as a tourist destination that the workers who make the tourism industry function can no longer afford to live anywhere near their jobs. Mackinac Island's version of that story is simply older than most and more extreme, because the island's total isolation, its total dependence on ferries and small aircraft, and its complete ban on the one piece of infrastructure, the automobile, that might otherwise let workers commute in cheaply from somewhere less expensive, leaves the island with no release valve at all. There is no cheaper suburb across the water. There is only the ferry dock, the mainland town of St. Ignace or Mackinac City, and a population of commuting workers who, unlike a mainland resort town, cannot simply drive in for a shift and drive home again at the price of gas. Every winter, the transformation becomes almost total. The million or so annual visitors disappear almost entirely between November and April. The hotels, including the Grand Hotel itself, close their doors and will not reopen until spring. The horses that pull carriages all summer are largely shipped off the island for the season, since there is no summer tourist traffic left to carry, and feeding hundreds of horses through a Michigan winter with no incoming revenue makes no economic sense. What is left is the true, permanent Mackinac Island. A few hundred residents, a skeleton crew keeping essential ferry service running so the island does not become entirely cut off, and a landscape whose two most famous features, the horse-drawn carriages and the crowded fudge shop windows, are both, for months at a time, almost completely absent. The island's own marketing has started acknowledging this dual identity directly, describing a place that in summer draws crowds so dense it can feel like a theme park, and in winter empties out so completely that snowmobiles, technically against the rules, become the only practical way for residents to get around at all. None of this shows up in the visitor statistics that make Mackinac Island sound like an unqualified American tourism success story. The island's Grand Hotel still hosts roughly 130,000 overnight guests a year and has welcomed 6 sitting or future United States presidents through its doors since the 1950s. The fudge shops still sell an estimated 10,000 pounds of fudge on the island's busiest single days. The visitor numbers keep climbing, not falling, and by the ordinary measure any city planner would use to judge a tourism economy. Healthy visitor volume and rising hotel occupancy, Mackinac Island looks like it is winning. But a tourism economy and a functioning year-round community are not the same thing, and Mackinac Island has spent more than a century quietly trading away the second in order to protect the first. Every zoning decision that kept new housing off the island to preserve its historic character, every choice to keep the automobile ban absolute rather than make an exception for year-round worker transportation, every hotel's decision to staff up with cheaper seasonal exchange labor rather than raise wages high enough to attract and retain American workers who could afford to live there permanently, has pushed the island further toward becoming something closer to a very well-preserved, extremely profitable stage set than an actual American town. The cannon still fires every morning from the walls of Fort Mackinac. The carriages still run down Main Street past window after window of fudge and saltwater taffy, exactly the way they have for well over 100 years. If you did not know what to look for, you would never guess, watching the crowds move down that street in July, that the school behind them enrolls fewer children than a single elementary school classroom on the mainland, or that the workers handing out samples of fudge in those windows mostly flew here from thousands of miles away, because the math of living on this island simply does not work for the Americans who might otherwise want the job. Mackinac Island did not fail to attract people. It succeeded so completely at attracting visitors that it priced out almost everyone who might have wanted to actually stay. The postcard is real. It is just increasingly a postcard of a place that, underneath the fudge and the horses and the Victorian porches, fewer and fewer people can afford to call home. If you want to see the next American place where success and disappearance turned out to be the same story, subscribe, because it's already waiting behind the next dock.